How many of you, at any point in your training, from your school days onwards through college, how many of you have actually received specific training or education in the nature of sleep problems in individuals and their management? Put up your hands if you have. So there's 3, so that's not bad. That's 3 more than usually put up their hands. But I think that's a good example, and I have the same experience with my trainees in London of just how tragically rare training is in this very important area. So I don't have enough time to tell you all about sleep problems, but I'm going to cover 3 or 4 vital areas with you. First, I'm going to share with you some community epidemiological data, which emphasizes just how common and detrimental these issues are. Secondly, we're going to look at the vital importance of behavioral and environmental approaches, which should always be the first line of treatment. Thirdly, I'm going to share with you some information on some very interesting, recently developed and relatively safe medications, which in conjunction with those environmental and behavioural measures can bring enormously good relief, not just to the individual with the sleep difficulties, but also their families as well. Should this be working somehow? Thank you. So here's a couple of egotistical references to keep you going. And please, if any of you would like me to send you illegal copies over the internet, then do give me your email address afterwards and I'll be delighted to do so. So the first is a review article I wrote a few years ago covering this area, and it also covers most of what I have to say in this talk. The next... This still isn't working. That's better. No, yes, that's it. Thank you. The next is a paper written recently covering use of medication in all aspects of child mental health as it relates to young people with developmental difficulties, and that should be useful as well. Let's see whether I can use this. Good. So when we're talking about sleep difficulties, the first thing to bear in mind is, as with any other area of knowledge, once you start to look at it, you realize how many aspects to it there are. So the first step we find is to differentiate between the different aspects that we would refer to as sleep difficulties. Clearly, this can be in a general sense of being unable to sleep, insomnia. It may be more specifically difficulties in falling asleep, so-called sleep induction difficulties or settling difficulties. Quite often we find there are recurrent nighttime wakenings and also early morning waking in the early hours with impossibility of getting back to sleep again. And then we have a large group, which I won't have time to go into detail today, but they are very common and often very debilitating, the so-called parasomnias, conditions like nightmares and night terrors, sleep talking, sleepwalking, sleep reversal, where you sleep during the day and stay awake at night, and sleep paralysis. But we're going to be focusing on the top 3 or so of those today, and also more specifically focusing on those conditions which are particularly common in childhood and young people. Let's look first at the situation of sleep disorders in the general population of children and young people. And we start with the definitive Isle of Wight study, which was undertaken in the 1970s by Rutter, Graham and Ewell, really exploring the basis of child mental health problems, how common they are, their nature, and indeed what can be done to help. And they found, quite worryingly, that as many as 15 to 20% of children and young people were experiencing clinically significant sleep difficulties, which, as I've mentioned, could be sleep induction problems, repeated nighttime waking, early morning waking, or parasomnias. And perhaps not surprisingly, but worryingly, they found very strong associations between the sleep difficulties and other aspects, such as daytime behavioural problems, parental stress and depression, particularly maternal, family discord, even to the point of parental separation, and poor educational attainments. So these were far from being simple or innocuous problems, very severe, causing really very severe problems for the entire family. The next development was a substantial study by Lynn Quine in the early 1990s exploring the predicament for children and young people with developmental disabilities. And she undertook a longitudinal study looking at 200 individuals with moderate to profound intellectual disability. Again, her data was extremely worrying. 51%, approximately half of the children, had difficulties settling to sleep. 67%, approximately two-thirds of the children, were waking repeatedly through the night. And a third of the parents, in a way I'm surprised it wasn't more, but a third of the parents reported rarely getting enough sleep. In my clinic, I always ask the parent of the child with sleep difficulties, how many hours sleep, how many hours of uninterrupted sleep are you getting a night? And I want to share with you that it's really quite common for the parent to say, bleary-eyed and semi-consciously, perhaps 1 to 2 hours if I'm lucky. To which I then ask, how come you're still alive? And they say, I'm really not sure. And you know, as a psychiatrist, I was always taught, and it's quite right, that insomnia, sleep difficulties, is a symptom of depression. Well, in this situation, it's the opposite. If you have a child that can't sleep, then you as a parent can't sleep, and so actually depression is a symptom of insomnia, but the treatment isn't psychotherapy or a medication for the parent, it's helping the child to sleep, and that will alleviate the parent's difficulties. We can look at other developmental disabilities like the Autism Spectrum, where we find equally concerning data. Between 44 and 83% of individuals with autism spectrum disorders show a sleep disturbance. That's present in terms of the individual's comments, I can't sleep, and the parent's ones, she can't sleep, and difficulties falling asleep and staying asleep again. There are certain specific biochemical and genetic associations, which again I don't have time to go into, but the details are in the review paper that I wrote. But part of those issues do appear to relate to the important chemical melatonin, which we'll come back to in a while. And it may well be that in many individuals with developmental disabilities, the important so-called circadian rhythm of melatonin secretion, whereby it should be lowest in the mornings and highest in the evenings, is deranged. So maybe one's not producing enough melatonin, maybe the receptors in your brain aren't sensitive enough to it, or maybe there isn't this cyclical pattern, so you're secreting the same amount throughout the 24-hour cycle. And that would explain, at least in part, why you cannot sleep properly. Now, as I've said, the first line of treatment should always be behavioural, but even before that, environmental. Is the room dark enough? Is the room quiet enough? Is the room conducive to sleep, so the right temperature with a right routine of behaviours leading up to bedtime, and then to consider other approaches, extinction, ignoring the behaviour. My child cries at night. Actually, children, generally speaking, don't come to harm through crying a bit, and then they'll learn that actually this isn't a way to gain parental attention. Positive reinforcement, the encouragement, the incentives to behave in a particular way, and acknowledging that you're not going to be able to reach the gold standard immediately. You need to do it in stages, so-called successive approximations. The antecedent contingencies are the ones I mentioned in terms of environment being appropriate, and the discriminant learning. Always sleep in the bedroom, always stay awake in the playroom. Simple and obvious, but very rarely actually applied. And that all-important thing, the regular, structured, predictable and calming bedtime routine. But sometimes that's just not enough. Why isn't it enough? Well, because there are two major determinants that help us sleep psychologically. The first is the ones that we use most, which have the wonderful German word, Zeitgebers, which Mike has told me I've spelt incorrectly. It's a German word, so it should have a capital Z. I apologise, Mike. And these mean, of course, time givers. We know that it's time to go to sleep because it's getting dark outside, we've drawn the curtains, the birds have stopped singing, the news bulletin is coming on the television, and my partner has arrived with a nice warm milky drink to calm me down. So I know psychologically that's the time to sleep. If you have difficulties in comprehending the passage of time and the impact of certain social experiences, as in many individuals with complex developmental disabilities, you then have to rely on the biological stimuli to sleep. Which is the main one? Melatonin. Is that deranged in these individuals? Yes, Jeremy's already said so. So therefore, moving on to the medical components, which should always be used in addition to, rather than instead of the environmental and behavioural ones I mentioned, one can, in the first instance, supplement melatonin. And as you can see, it has a nice long chemical name, N-acetyl 5-methoxytryptamine. It's secreted from the pineal gland at the base of your brain in response to diminishing light levels. It should be, as I say, highest in the evening, lowest in the morning. In the United States, and I understand here it's available as a food supplement, therefore not on prescription, but also sadly meaning there's no standardization and guarantee about the quality and potency of the content of each tablet or capsule. In the United Kingdom, it's classified as a pharmaceutical agent, so therefore it's only available through prescription from a specialist, and therefore there is better control of the quality of the contents. It is available through other means as well. For a while, there was a product marketed in British supermarkets called Sleepytime Milk, which was milk that had been obtained from cows just as they were about to fall asleep in the evening when the melatonin level would be greatest within the milk. And there was a wonderful image on the bottle of a cow falling asleep with ZZZ coming out of the mouth as a sound and a little nightcap on. I bought a bottle, I drank it and immediately fell asleep, which probably just shows the power of placebo rather than anything active. But looking at this biochemical pathway, which you don't have to understand fully, but I'd bring you to your attention the fact that in that pathway is the neurotransmitter serotonin, which of course is the one we call the happy neurotransmitter. It's the agent that we use in people with severe depressions, and there's a lot of debate about whether melatonin is having a direct effect in helping you fall asleep, or whether it's via different routes, for example, as a hypnotic, or in this situation as a mood enhancer, and therefore helping you sleep better. But in fact, melatonin works in a very novel way as what's called a chronotropic agent. It helps reset the body clock. It's not primarily a sedative or tranquilizer. It acts by a very different mechanism. It's naturally occurring. It's very safe. There have been some worries that it might aggravate epilepsy or asthma, but these have been unfounded. And the data on it goes back to the mid-1990s when Jan and his colleagues in the British Columbia Children's Hospital in Vancouver did this clinical series of children with developmental disabilities and found, quote, significant health, behavioural and social benefits, as well as improved sleep. However, responses were not always complete. They varied substantially. And they acknowledged that actually it wasn't a proper study, it wasn't double-blind, but in their follow-up they felt that the benefits were maintained. Now, I mentioned certain genetic conditions because some do have specific sleep issues. Smith-Magenis syndrome, we heard earlier in the day, that has particular sleep difficulties, as is the case for children with tuberous sclerosis. And there have been some studies looking at these and other conditions like Rett syndrome, confirming, I think, that whatever your genetic syndrome or otherwise, you can benefit from melatonin. I know I do. When I go to the west coast of the States, I take it for my jet lag, and it works very well. I wake up in the morning feeling euphoric after a good night's sleep. That's probably because I'm on the west coast of the States and about to do, hopefully, a well-received talk in a conference, but maybe, just maybe, there's a biochemical component to it. We did a massive study in the United Kingdom a few years ago, headed up by Paul Gringrass, my colleague, and as you can see, this was a randomized, double-blind or double-masked, placebo-controlled trial looking at sleep problems in children with neurodevelopmental disabilities and seeing the benefits or otherwise of melatonin supplementation. And as you can see, the results finally showed at first sight quite a lot of promise. The total sleep time went up significantly. In other words, in almost all children on the melatonin rather than placebo, they improved. But the actual time difference wasn't that great. They fell asleep perhaps 40 minutes earlier. They slept perhaps 25 minutes longer. But actually, they woke up earlier as well. So the duration of their improved sleep wasn't that much improved. However, the parents loved it. They thought it was fantastic. And maybe that says, firstly, something about the crudeness of the assessment instruments we were using, but also the fact that quality of sleep is important as well. So if there's a predictability that you know as a parent when you will be able to fall asleep and when you have to wake up, that's far better than the uncertainty and erraticness of most sleep difficulties. So we can say about melatonin that it's highly beneficial, certainly in the short term. Individuals do seem to gain so-called tolerance, that the benefits dwindle, but the answer then is to give them a drug holiday for a few weeks, and usually their brain resensitizes. In the few minutes remaining, because time is out, I'll just... one is Clonidine, which is an alpha agonist, and this was initially developed for hypertension, high blood pressure in adults, as well as being good for migraine. But in children, we found that as well as being useful for ADHD, it is actually quite beneficial for sleep. And we published on that a clinical series showing that children where there were sleep difficulties, whether in association with ADHD or not, benefited from it. Very quickly, before Mike drags me off the stage, I just want to mention some cutting-edge research. We're starting to explore a medication called acebutolol, again developed for high blood pressure in adults. Turns out that this is a melatonin antagonist. So very briefly, rather than giving melatonin in the evening to help you fall asleep, you can, in addition to that, or instead of it, give acebutolol in the morning to help them wake up. And we've had one very spectacular case with a child with Prader-Willi syndrome who was persistently falling asleep on return from school at 3 in the afternoon, only to wake up at 11 p.m. at night and stay awake thereafter. By giving him acebutolol when he came home from school, he was able to stay awake until a normal bedtime, thereby re-establishing his sleep-wake cycle.